student government, SMU Crossfade. In open opposition, School of Hard Knocks. In closing government, IIUA. Becca. Graduate of myself, Amrit, Hannah, Mubarak, Sharon, Darshan, and Hamad. That's Hamad. Okay, thank you, Hamad. Okay, on the motion that this House abandoned the notion that secularism is universally desirable for democracies, before I start the debate, I would like to remind the audience about being quiet, because if you're not, it is just rude. You are not making your parents proud. So let's make our parents proud and do a better place. Also, Biha will be timing. Woo! Yeah! Okay, I'd like to invite the Honorable Prime Minister to start the debate. That's not your mic. That's the No, wait, one second.
Oh. Can you hear me? Hello? Hello?
Hello?
No! Hold it. Or like move it closer or something. Okay, up to you, up to you.
Okay, cool. Can I start now?
Change the angle of that live stream mic.
Wait, what do you want me to do with this?
Yes. Correct.
Okay? Okay, I'm going to start now. To be blind to the differences between different races is also to be blind to the inequality that often divides them. We think that secularism is a notion that different races all ought to be treated more or less equally by the democratic government. But we think that the idea of secularism is one thing, but very often the execution looks very different. On our side, we want our governments to be sensitive to the flaws of absolute secularism, to understand that sometimes enforcing secularism, enforcing some notion of equality might be more harmful than helpful to the minorities that we want to protect on-site opening government. We think that democracy ought not to be just about equality of treatment. We think it ought to be about equality of freedoms and equality of opportunity. And insofar as very often, many of these minority groups in different governments or in different states all over the world start out on an uneven playing field. We want to have a world where the government tries its best to meet the needs of all of these groups on the basis of that need, rather than simply trying to pretend to be equality. We think that very often democracy becomes an instrument of majoritarian domination, right? The point where these groups are an ethnic minority. We think that very often it becomes easy for majority groups to push their worries, their concerns, the suffering that they engage with in their everyday life under the carpet, under the idea that everybody has got to be treated equally. This is the sort of thing that leads to problems like Laiste in France, right? When individuals are unable to, for example, access halal food in schools, are unable to wear the tudong and walk around on the street because nobody is allowed to have access to religious symbols. On the surface, prima facie, it seems like something that's fair. It seems like something that is equal. But we think that very often the enforcement of this equality leads to groups that have special needs being oppressed, right? We think that that's something that it's very difficult to defend on their side of the house. What we prefer is a hyper-racial paradigm, right? We think that it's okay to treat different people differently. We think a good example of this is a state like Singapore, right? Where for example, we allocate land for mosques, where, for example, we allocate different holidays for different racial groups, right? We think that very often these reparative policies or policies that are designed to address historical inequality or the inability of these groups to change the environment within a democratic structure is important, right? So when we're talking about democracy, the idea behind it is supposed to be that individuals are able to change and to be able to have some sort of control over the environment. I think the principle of it is supposed to be that different people are able to... Yeah, I'll take it in a moment, all right? Like, we think the principle of it is supposed to be that different groups are able to have some equality or at least some ability to influence their environment, right? But we think that at the point where secularism becomes a political battering ram, where it becomes an ideology that allows people, that allows majorities or allows extremists to deny the specific needs of these minorities under the guise of something that is universally sacred, that is held as an article of faith, we think that it has failed in its purpose. But yo, what's up?
No, we think the definition of secularism is one that you're screwing. The reality is, secularism simply means the state is not to intervene in religion. So that's why Singapore is a secular state, not a religious one.
So Singapore does intervene in religion, guys. I know you guys are Malaysian, but this is a thing that happens. We've got a little clause in the constitution that says, hello, like Malay people are able to get special rights. Some of these guys don't pay the same university fees that I do, and we think that that's okay, right? We think that that's not secular because that's treating different groups differently on the basis of like their ethnicity. No duh, right? But we think that that becomes problematic, right? Like we think that it is at that point that it's a point where secularism becomes that battering ram. That it becomes difficult for us to do this, right? Because we think that because we think that majority groups are very easily able to brush these things under the carpet. Right? They're able to say that, oh, everybody should be treated equally. But the truth is, these groups are often unable to access the same sort of political momentum or the same sort of political traction that majorities are able to, right? Either by dint of the fact that they happen to be a numerical minority or because historical circumstances have left them unable to engage with democracy in other ways, right? For example, they don't have a lot of money. For example, the fact that perhaps the state gerrymandered them and broke them up, putting them into all different little districts. I know some countries where this happens. I don't think it's a good thing, right? But we think that at that point, in order to enable these individuals to fairly access like the metrics or to fairly access these frameworks of democracy, we need some sort of reparative policy. No, thank you, right? So we think that the next thing that's problematic is that very often secularism itself, when it's held as something, when it's held as an article of faith, right? When it's held as something which is impossible to challenge or universally desirable, right? Then we think that it can be taken to extremes just like any other ideology, right? We point you to places like France, for example, where this laicity means that it's very difficult, for example, for any like scientific like organization or university to conduct research that happens to be tainted with this racial taboo, right? So that makes it extremely difficult for these groups, for these minority groups to get what they deserve. So one example of this is the fact that one example is the fact that there's very little research that is done into like different like incomes like across different ethnic groups, right? There's very little research done into where the geographic distribution of these groups is, right? And that makes it again very difficult for these groups to actually get what they need, right? Because at the point where we are not sensitive to the specific problems that these groups face, the specific underprivileging that comes from the origin in a particular ethnic group or from a particular ethnic background, we think that it makes it more difficult for us to redress the unfairnesses that have already been inflicted upon them, right? So we think that the next thing I want to talk about is at the harms that come from this entrenchment of inequality, right? We think that at the point where this happens, it becomes very easy for these minority groups who already suffer a great deal in daily life to become resentful of a state that seems to be ignoring their specific needs, right? We think that at the point where we have a government that is very willing to engage with these groups in terms of like discourse or to engage in consultative processes, right? We think that makes it a lot more difficult for us to have healthy racial relationships, right? We think that at the point where we follow this hyper-racial paradigm, where we acknowledge the specific needs of these minorities, it becomes a lot more easy for these individuals to trust the state. And it's at that point we cut down on a lot of radical extremism, right? We break this cumulative cycle of us treating minorities badly and them getting angry and engaging in radical behaviors like violence or political violence, for example. We think that at that point, when we improve these racial relationships and we improve the trust that these minorities have in their governments, we actually lubricate the gears of democracy, right? We need to acknowledge underprivilege. The playing field is not equal. We need to open our eyes and see that that is so. Very happy to propose.
Thank you very much for that speech. I'd like to invite the leader of the opposition.
Guys, nowhere in the definition of a secular state is it implied that you have to be blind to racial difference. Secular states can recognize inequality on the basis of race without being a religious state. We think the definition of a secular state is one where state and church are separate, and OG has to defend a situation where the notion that governments can have some interference with regard to religion is acceptable. So we think that given this context, the problem is that religious states often throughout history have been unitary and expansionist, eroding public space for the very minorities that OG was trying to protect. What is our stance? First of all, we stand for the separation of church and state. We stand for the freedom to believe in whatever God you choose, regardless of who the majority race is. Very intuitive things that OG generally agree with. Secondly, we are comfortable with politicians making people aware of what their beliefs are, but not using them as a basis to define what their public policy positions should be. We're going to forward two arguments. First of all, that religion is antithetical in all respects to democracy. Secondly, about the harms to religious states should religious parties come into power. But before that, some refutation. They say a state that is sensitive to racial inequality is by definition a non-secular state. No, we can provide welfare to disadvantaged groups without being a religious state on the basis of the fact that there is inequality. The definition of secular states, as we have mentioned, are states where there is a separation of church and government, where religion has no role in defining what public policy is. In fact, religious states make it far harder to recognize the disadvantages faced by other religions, because now there's always the excuse that these religions are illegitimate, that we must always support the religion of the majority party. It is overwhelmingly likely that in religious states, majority groups will have control of the government, and laws that allow for things like the enshrinement of the holidays of other religions won't actually come into effect. For your information, Singapore is by far and away a secular state. There's no reason why OG can claim it as an example for their side. There are some minor points about signs and minorities. First of all, we'd like to point out that in non-religious states and secular states, we have plenty of research about income inequality already to begin with. We think that, moreover, religious states are far less likely to fund such research because they support an overriding and singular conception of religion. Now I'm going to move on to the first argument. The rest of the rebuttal to their points about minorities will be integrated. First of all, about why religion is antithetical to democracy. Democracy holds as its foundation the belief that there are no closed ethical questions or questions of public policy. A second core trait of democracy is the presumption that people ought to have the freedom to express their own identity and believe in their own gods, unmolested by the court of public opinion or condemnation. We think that allowing non-secular public policy is harmful for a number of reasons. First of all, it creates public debate not based on contestable principles, like, for example, whether meritocracy or affirmative action is best at empowering minorities, but based on religious principles. So these tend to be hard to contest because they're inherently somewhat touristic, right? Often religious texts predicate their beliefs in the fact that God said so, as opposed to a rational basis for these beliefs to exist. Any attempt to contest these principles, like, for example, arguing that the Bible might in fact be tolerant of homosexuality, results inevitably in mudslinging and personal offense. As a consequence, it is incredibly hard to debate these principles in a religious state. So we'd rather these principles be based in secular ideals where they can be contested and where they can be debated. Even if CG gives us the example of constitutions, often the basis for parliamentary debates about whether to overturn constitutions or introduce new clauses can be debated rationally on fairly objective criteria, like, for example, utilitarian grounds. So we think that religious states fundamentally are antithetical to the democratic principle that ideas are created equal. Moreover, secondly, religious states create exclusionary chambers of public space. Religions are often mutually exclusive. To a Muslim man in a Christian theocracy, which is what OG perhaps inevitably has to support, a government that denies the existence of his God as the one true God is one that is inherently offensive to his most cherished beliefs. Moreover, we think that more problematically, religions are often static in their condemnation of certain immutable characteristics about human beings. Like, for example, the condemnation of homosexuality or non-binary gender individuals under the Christian faith. Yes?
There is still an ongoing discussion between big government and small government. That is something that is hard to come to a conclusion. Why is this acceptable?
I don't understand why the discussion about big or small government figures in the discussion about religious states. We can have a discussion about big and small government without, on rational grounds, without relying on offensive religious principles or perhaps implying that another person's religious beliefs may not be true. So I'm not too clear what the point of that point of information was. Okay, second argument about the harms of religious states. Having established that in principle, religion is antithetical to democracy in terms of providing free expression of identity, I'm going to prove that religious states result in some tangible harms should religious parties actually be allowed to come into power under a non-secular framework. Let's establish what many religions are like, especially that those that tend to become state religions. Many religions place a huge emphasis on proselytization in the case of the Abrahamic faiths or some branches of Buddhism. For example, even for non-proselytizing faiths, and this is important, people become emboldened to spread what they see as religious truth once it becomes government law. And this nicely deals with any point that government will want to bring up, that is essentially the religions that come into power tend to be the ones that are the more moderate. This leads to a number of harms, particularly to other religious groups. We know that religious states in particular as well tend to be self-reinforcing, especially since alternative religions have their views shut out, have their members converted, or have their members leave the country under the face of inevitable or perceived persecution. As a consequence, religious states tend to be self-reinforcing. This leads to a number of harms. First of all, it's even more harmful to the minorities I talked about in my first point of substantive. Moreover, secondly, we think this leads to more conservatism and a slide into fundamentalism. When people are encouraged to view themselves in religious terms, they are more likely to vote along conservative lines. We think that at a worst level, this could slip back further into expansionism and theocracy, like we saw in many religious states. On a basic level, even if this doesn't happen, we think that religious conservatism threatens minorities like sexual minorities even more, because the more conservative beliefs tend to be the ones that target them the most. Most liberal sections in every faith tend to be those that support the separation of church and state, and those that are the ones that are shut out by religious states. Third harm. Religious states tend to erode secular norms that allow them to rise into prominence to begin with. We just have to look at the example of India, where there's a slight slide back towards authoritarianism due to Modi and the BJP. Or a more extreme example would be Middle Eastern Sunni dictatorships, which were perhaps at some point, in some cases, democracies. So we think that religious states tend to erode secular norms because of their propensity to rely on things like the Bible or the justification of a divine being in order to justify the valid proposition for them remaining in power. They tend, and as a consequence, they tend to be self-reinforcing, and there's an erosion of secular norms that happen. The last harm that we bring to you is that religious states often concentrate political power in the hands of a very self-checking, privileged religious elite. States will extensively build up patronage networks with elite scholars in an attempt to better and more accurately represent the religion that got them into power. This leads to things like capture, for example, where only a few privileged elite individuals can then have access to the chambers of power and determine what state policy should be. So it creates a world where privileged imams or Christian Catholic scholars and archbishops are the ones that behind the scenes determine government policy, especially because governments want to appear true or want to appear genuine in their representation of religion. So, because religious states erode the norms of democracy and because they're antithetical to everything we believe in, we're very proud to stand in the world.
Very much like yeah.
We find the case coming out from opposition very weird. Like, they kind of want to do a definition challenge, but not really. But even if they wanted to do so, right, like, they never really engaged with the things that Jordan was talking about in his speech. We think Jordan's case makes a lot of sense. Number one, if you replace, for example, hyper-racial with hyper-religious, like the kind of context that you, but even if it isn't the case, we think race still plays a part in this debate, because we think like the absence of secularism is also things like state having specific policies to prioritize and benefit specific races. Therefore, we think all of the legitimate analysis that Jordan brought up in this speech was simply just like not even dealt with by the leader of opposition, right? Instead, just claim that this is not secularism, therefore we're going to move on. Even if you wanted to contest that, you need to tell us why, like, our definition of secularism is not legitimate grounds to do so, and he didn't contest that. But we will contest their definition if they really want us to do so. One of the few things that he told us. This secularism is a recognition that there's the separation of church and state. Even if we agree that this is particularly true, we think the burden for opening government in this debate is not to prove why secularism is net bad or like always bad, right? We think the purpose or the burden of us to prove is why secularism in like specific cases cannot always be considered as a priori good for democracies. That's why Jordan's analysis about like how secularism hurts democracy is particularly important, because we think certain forms of religious expression are legitimate in society, and we think the state needs to facilitate these sort of religious expressions, as I'll point out later in my constructive, because it is this kind of religious expression that like empowers individuals who are often like in the minority of that particular who are often minorities in those states. Even if you were to accept that it is about the separation of church and state, we think even a country like the United States is not really secular, right? We have things like "In God We Trust" as the official motto, or like the fact that when you like take an oath, for example, you always often use the Bible. We think that the United States also like religion also pervades in terms of politics in the United States, where, for example, a lot of individuals believe like religious leaders when crafting political opinions. Why is this particularly important? This analysis deals directly with their assertion that you can never have legitimate political discourse just because we have religious theory. We don't think this is true. We think the converse is more true. think religions can also provoke a lot of questions which are particularly important, i.e., like for example, in the Bible, the perception of homosexuality. Why are these discussions still relevant and still have merit in politics? Because the point of democracy is also about the expression of identity, just as author conceded. This is important because a lot of people construct their identity based on their religions. Based, like a lot of people's political expression is also based on their religion. That is why some individuals truly feel that homosexuality is something that they're not comfortable with, because the Bible tells them that the Bible, as part of their identity construction, tell them this is something that is not legitimate. We think the only way for you to engage with these individuals is to accept the merit of these religious discussions. Because at the point in time where you don't, right, that is when you get more politically divisive societies where where individuals never really engage with religious people, because they believe that all of their political values have no faith, right? All their political values have no merit. That's at the point in time where you get worse kinds of political discourse that they want to talk about. So don't try to pretend that you get some sort of arbitrary good discourse just because secularism is a priori good. We think the difficulty here and why we need religious expression is because it's harder to change minds when you're not accepting individuals' schools of thought. We are also not expected on this case to defend theocracies, right? Because that's not a burden. They give very extreme characterization of what their world looks like. We don't think the world on our side looks like a case where only one religion dominates the sphere. Even if we accept their worst case that they're religious political parties, we think there can be multiple religious political parties of different articles of faith. Because at the end of the day, we are still talking about democracies, right? Even if we have more religious parties, we think people still have the freedom to choose whether they want those parties to lead them, right? We don't think they're going to we don't think religious parties are going to campaign just on the basis of religion alone, because that's not enough to win you elections in a democracy. You may win you elections in an authoritarian regime or corrupt regime, but not in democracies. Why? Because you can vote out the leaders if you feel like they're not representative of your interests. You can take away the time that they have on air if you feel that those individuals are not truly representative of your party. We think the ability of democracy for you to express your identity and weaponize that in the form of votes also mean that you can choose whether you want religious freedoms, and you can also curtail the scope of religious expression within your society. Why then is secularism extremely undesirable? Why then can secularism sometimes not be desirable, especially so in democracies? But before that, yes.
So do you feel that in a non-secular state, there should be a government religion? And if so, which one of the benefits are exclusive to there being a government religion?
What is a government religion anyway? Okay, if on our right, we think governments and democracies can still say that there are 3 religions or 4 main religions within our states. We don't think governments are going to say, here, this is the only religion they are allowed to believe in. We think that's extremely unfair, comparative, right? I don't get this from opening opposition. Okay, we think secularism is not just about equal treatment, but it's also about the intervention of religious theology and why those things can be important. We think that religious influence can be good. Why? For example, things such as Islamic law, for example, is extremely important to a lot of individuals because it protects people of that particular faith in areas of family law, for example, in areas of marriages, in areas where you get in areas of divorces, for example. We think those kind of laws, for example, that are constructed on religious principles can sometimes be extremely important to people who believe in that particular religion, because that is how they construct their way of life. Why then is this argument particularly important in the scope of this debate? Jordan explained to you how we need to consider the rights of individuals who feel that their religion or race is central to their living construction of the world. We think even in the cases of race, for example, right, which Jordan rightfully pointed out, we think oftentimes is at the point in time where you don't always prioritize secularism, that you have states specifically giving rights or specifically changing their treatment towards individuals of specific groups. That's why all of his analysis about the state treating Malay people in Singapore, treating the Chinese dialects in Singapore differently makes a lot of sense, because principally it's also important to consider the notion of the fact that different individuals in different particular groups behave very differently, and we need to allow for their expression to be recognized as particularly legitimate. We think religious expression is also important to people because specific treatment can be good. The second thing that I will say is that sometimes we think secularism can sometimes be antithetical to the principles and the values of democracy as well. Why? What should democracy essentially stand for? We think democracy is oftentimes an expression of yourself and the ability to know that you have rights and you have your freedoms to exercise those rights. We think religious expression is an extension of those rights. Why do we then think that this extension needs to be as far as allowing religions to permeate into state ideology? We think this can be good in a lot of ways, because oftentimes when individuals base their identity on their religion and feel that it is important for the state to recognize those rights, we think that's at the point in time where states can intervene and states can include it as part of their policy. We're also not forcing all kinds of democracies to adopt this, but we are saying we need to stop stop believing in the notion that secularism is universally always accepted and always good in democracies. Because even in democracies, we think you have people who are hyper-racial, people who are hyper-religious and feel that their religious expression needs to be protected. For all of those reasons, right? Because secularism cannot be seen as a universally good thing, and because we need to protect the rights of individuals to have fundamental religious expression that is essential to their identity, I'm very, very proud to propose.
Thank you very much. To conclude the opening exchange,
Madam Speaker, democracy presupposes that no matter what your creed, whichever gods you pray to, there will be a common space that everyone can call home. What we think is that religion is inimical to this common space, and I'm going to show you why in two areas. One, on protecting minorities, and two, on discourse. First, on protecting minorities. Now, LG has lost this debate in the first 10 seconds when they defined Singapore as a non-secular state. Read my lips. We challenged the definition. So it is not the case that our approach was confusing. Secularism simply means a separation of church and state. We don't see why being secular makes it harder for states to address historical wrongs. Is there a special luminal quality to God that makes it easier for African Americans to point to the indignity they suffered in Alabama and Birmingham? No! We think that even if we take OG's argument at its very best, which I assume is identity politics cannot work without religious political parties, that's a terrible case for two reasons. One, because it assumes that identity politics is itself an effective means to uplift minorities. We find it hard to see how majority religions that will invariably find themselves represented in the political parties that reflect the interests of the majority in parliament will help minority groups. And I hope, closing just knives, okay? I really just hope. But second, even if you don't believe this, we think this is crass ethnic essentialism. It isn't true that people of a particular ethnicity is always an adherent to a particular faith. If I'm a Malay person in Singapore, to tell me that my interests are best served if I vote for a Muslim party locks me into that particular conception of a religiously bound identity. We think that if they want to protect ethnic minorities, then they need to understand that the color of your skin does not actually connect directly to the God you pray to. That's OG out of this debate. They also, by the way, did not rebut any of the mechanisms. For example, that minorities like LGBTQ individuals might be hurt because religion sometimes tends to be rooted in certain fairly conservative or archaic texts that's very difficult to separate yourself from, especially when it comes to elections where passions run high. They didn't rebut our point on how this leads to a slide towards conservatism, because when the organs of the state are able to be used to influence the generations of the future, that's when people are more likely to engage in religiously rhetorical discourse and echo chamber within the country. Third, they did not deal with our point on the erosion of secular norms, that when your entire justice system, for example, or your legal creed is defined by religious interests, that's when minorities are hurt. Four, they did not deal with how religion is inimical to democracy because it is subject to capture by a religious elite. When your scholars hold special political capacity to influence the outcome of an election by reading biblical text or Quranic text in a certain way, that's when you actually make governance more technocratic in a religious sense. You actually take power away from the people to be able to define it. That's OG out of this debate. Okay. Then they told us that we don't accept the case that religions are going to dominate. Then what is the case? Now, give me a moment. Yes.
So we can still have things like Islamic law, for example, coexist with like the secular law of that country, right? Because we recognize that we need to treat individuals. Why is that like not okay?
Well, that's not okay because people can't just opt in and out whatever legal contracts they want, right? Like if I decide to go with Arthur and I say, okay, if I steal your pencil, you get to cannibalize me. Even though we put our signatures on that, the state steps in to protect ourselves from causing harm. Like for you to say we can divide the nation into a patchwork of contractual legal obligations makes no sense. It erodes the common space for people to engage interactions with each other. That's you out of the debate. Okay, so I'm not sure what the case is at the end of the day, okay? So let's deal with that minority thing and move on to discourse. And here's where I deal with closings POI. And I think they run the right case. I think what they're saying is, the difference between religious and secular ideas is exactly the same as the difference between competing political philosophies. Okay, I disagree because I have to. 3 reasons why. One, Political philosophies and make normative judgments that arise in response to present-day problems. Communism arose as a response to the robber baron and cutthroat capitalism era of the early 1900s. Neoliberalism arose as a failure of the left-wing governments. The problem is these normative judgments are rooted in objective experiences. Religion concerns itself with the spiritual realm. It is detached from the lived experience. It is fundamentally impossible to engage with the normative judgments that religions are making, but it's easier to engage with the normative judgments that political philosophies are making. No. Second rebuttal, we think that religious goods are rooted in articles of faith, and therefore there is no common metric to judge said religious goods. How am I to say that my belief in a Christian God is more superior or more moral than, say, Arthur's belief in, whatever God Arthur chooses to pray to? Whereas the thing about political philosophies is that they have an overlapping set of consensus. For example, all politicians agree that we need to find out how to boost economic growth and help those who are in need. They just disagree as to the metrics in which we do that. And we can assess it objectively through things like GDP growth and your Gini coefficient. Third rebuttal to this idea. We think that when a political philosophy fails, it is obvious. For example, I can point you to the USSR, or I can point you to Venezuela. It is not easy to know when a religious political philosophy has failed, because they can always just say, but the benefits will accrue in heaven or utopia. And then you're just like, oh, okay, I mean, you say something like that, how can I rebut you, right? And at this point, it becomes inamicable to public debate. I can't engage with you in any constructive way. But before I go on, please.
So why can't people just say the way small government was implemented was wrong? There's a better way.
Well, I think at the point at which you make that claim, you also need to back up with evidence. For example, in this manner in which I've implemented small government, it has failed. And that creates common space for me to say, no, I disagree. I think there's a, for example, better way to implement a universal basic income. So I don't really agree with that POI. Okay, back to my case. Now, back to opening. They told us religion, I love this, right? Religion provokes discussion. And this is a good argument. It's an expressivist political argument. Because I really care about religion, I should have a seat at the democratic table. The problem comes when people believe this identity can be superimposed on the rest of the country. Like, we don't see why you can justify having religion as part of politics when Arthur talked to you about the scope creep that religion has when it comes to creating future generations of increasingly large religious majorities that can oppress minorities. We are not about to equate religion to harmful ideology, but we think there is a significant potentiality for harm, which is why governments have a duty of care to step in to prevent such expressivism from stepping over into potential harm. So we think that's OG out of this debate. So at the end of the day, why should we win? We win because first, we've demonstrated to you how religion causes significant direct harm to minorities. Second, because we've demonstrated the difference between religious ideas and political philosophical ideas. And third, because we have demonstrated that religion is inimical for discourse. For all these reasons, I'm incredibly proud to oppose.
I'd just like to remind the audience that whilst your laughter is amusing, it does not help the debate at all. It's like internal laugh or like internal amusement, whatever. Or like, yeah, as Amrit said, shut up. Okay, moving on. Member of government.
In the words of Subra, we don't have to knife, you just need to replace race with religion. Here's our case. So let's just deal with a few responses to what OO told you in this debate. Firstly, they told us that it's hard to discuss and there's no objective way of deciding many of these views. And then secondly, they told us that religion erodes democratic norms and that's something that is bad. Before I go on to responding to that, let me just flash out my arguments. In extension, I'm going to explain, firstly, why it's impossible for the state to be neutral on moral issues. Secondly, I'm going to explain why such restrictions are bad. Thirdly, I'm going to explain why this harms the fight for democracy in more third world context and the overtly religious context that they're talking about in this debate. Two responses before that. Firstly, about whether it's hard for you to discuss many of these things. I don't think this is a metric for you to shut out discussions in a democracy, because every discussion is hard and every discussion is continuously ongoing. The whole wankry about how it's about the timing doesn't make any sense in this debate, because if it was possible for us to deal with big government, small government debates, we wouldn't still be having those discussions till today. That's a discussion that we'll be having forever, and that's a valid discussion that people have a differing view and they want to protect it. Then they said it's only spiritual and not physical. Firstly, that is to you. But secondly, it is physical in a real way, and I don't think religious people are debating about heaven. I think they're debating about more things that have to do with the current world right now, and I'll explain to you with examples in my speech. But the second argument about how this erodes democratic norms, because it has to be one that is aggressive and one that is bad, meaning you quote verses and you impose your religion on other people. Just a short explanation on why this is not necessarily going to be the case. I think all this needs is for you to encourage people to use more neutral language in their discussions. You don't have to quote Quran chapter word verse word or the Bible for you to get any discussion on homosexuality or stem cell research or prostitution or many of these things that have core religious and moral discussions attached to them. You can simply use a religious inspired argument, but use it in a way that is neutral. The way in which we know this happens in status quo is that those who quote your Bibles are usually your people who are seen as crazy, and the kinds of people that you listen to, like Dennis Prager that we quoted now, are people who actually do that when they don't just use religious verses and tell you that you have to do this because God says so. That doesn't sound persuasive at all. I think more people are likely to do things in a way that is more persuasive than that. Moving on to my extension, firstly, why it's impossible for the state to be neutral on moral issues. I just want to point out that issues have religiously and morally charged concerns that are tangential to them in many instances. It is impossible for you to separate the moral concerns from that decision in itself. And given the fact that states cannot default to decision, they definitely need to take a decision in itself. Any stance taken by the state falls on one side of the moral coin. It is either you're endorsing this value or you are not. That means it is important for us to have these discussions, because the assumption and the premise of this debate so far has been that it is possible for you to make a neutral religious or neutral moral decision in status quo. I don't think that is true. So what if there are moral concerns with abortion? So what if there are moral concerns with prostitution? So what if there are moral concerns with stem cell research or same-sex marriage and all of these things? I think it is important for us to air many of these views, because there are credible arguments that can be made about these things, and it's not for you to say which is credible or which is not, especially when you consider that religion holds a very close place to the hearts of many people, given the fact that even if you do make a decision, like you say same-sex marriage is fine, you are falling on the moral side that says it is fine. It is not an amoral decision, it is a decision, it is a moral decision in itself, given that people should be able to have a discussion on whether it is okay or not. The sort of considerations you have on this side are, is this person a consenting adult, or what are the benefits of a certain policy like stem cell research? I think that those are discussions that are very vague and simplistic and don't pay attention to the vast majority of the moral claims that people have in status quo. That means you get a slimmer discussion, and a discussion that is very exclusionary to very important things that people have and all in status quo. So this idea that discussion has to be coerced isn't true, because again, that is not persuasive at all for me to say that because the Bible says this, therefore you shouldn't have stem cell research. I don't think those are the sort of people you get on CNN or you get in public discussing many of these things. Secondly, why such restrictions are bad. Sit down. I think the point here is that a state, a democracy, is one that is supposed to represent people. That means there is no objectively good policy. On your side, you take an objective stance that all religious and moral claims are bad, and that's a problem. I think the right for people to decide what sort of state that they want to live in is something that is important in this debate, especially when you consider that religion is something that is very close to the hearts of many people. So you can't simply wash it off as something that isn't important at all. I think it's against the idea of a collective police that you're able to come together and decide what sort of policies that you want and what sort of political society that you want to have. That's something that is bad. Because what happens on your side is, sure, you don't want to harm minorities, but you make religious people a minority that is excluded from political discussions, and that's and that's an injustice that we see. But secondly, this is often seen as a basis to push religious people. This is where you get your hijab bans and all these sort of things that you get in status quo, because you're likely to get more angry people who are religiously voting, and as the info slide explains to us, many of these people are things that enforce the idea that you definitely need to be more secular because you need to keep these people out. That's when you get more people quoting verses when they feel like you can't allow them to express their religion in itself. This leads to a race to the bottom where you begin to punish people for their own religious views, and that's something that we think is bad. politicians who by any means are religious are seen as people who are going to get into government and stop the government from being secular in itself. And that's the problem that we see on at the point in which you continue doing this in status quo. Some beliefs are definitely harmed and left out. Thirdly, I want to engage with this whole minority stuff in this debate before that closing. Opening. Okay.
Sorry. So help me understand, how are minorities helped when majorities have to dictate what they learn in school or what gods they pray to the church?
Come on, I just said I will do that after this POI. Okay. Why this harms the fight for democracy in other areas, right? So the context of where minorities are harmed are usually areas that are very religious in status quo. The problem with your side is what you do then is that you force and evangelize a version of democracy that says you must be secular. The problem with this is that this is something that is highly unpersuasive to many of these people and means that even areas that are slowly gaining acceptance of democracy and is becoming a little bit more liberal and allowing for minorities is one that stops and rejects it in many cases, because politicians are able to hamper on this and say this is Western colonial pressures and people who are religious are likely to buy into many of these things. That's why same-sex marriage wasn't legal in Nigeria, but homosexuals were very okay within that country. At the point in which Western governments began to push for those sort of secularism, that is when you got a law that banned it and meant that you would go to jail. I think you don't help these minorities within those deeply religious contexts that you want to talk about in this debate. Those people are harmed even more. If you want to engage with those countries, it is not by forcing down their throat secularism, it's by simply allowing for the people in that country to decide what sort of country they want to live in. Extremely proud to propose.
Someone like that phone.
Panel, it is precisely because religion is so near and dear to the hearts of many that we cannot allow it in the democratic process. The question here is not, is religion good, is religion bad, but rather, does religion cause you to be a captive audience? Does religion mean that you are able to buy into arguments without having them necessarily justified to you? And does your religion being represented in politics mean that nobody else's religion can be? The answer to all those three questions is a resounding yes. One big extension for you today on political discourse and the goals of democracy, 3 tiers. First of all, what is the goal of democracy? What is the common ground that we need and what the nature of religion is? Second tier, what does this do for the discourse of campaigning? Last of all, what does this do for policy outcomes? 2 quick rebuttals, everything else interwoven. First of all, let's talk about the secularism coming out from opening government. They say, so secularism too can become its own form of twisted religious doctrine. As you blindly adhere to it, maybe France is bad. Here's the thing, the reason why that doesn't happen is because secularism at least allows you a platform by which you can articulate your beliefs, a passage and kind of common language that you share with the people around you. That means you are less likely to have secularism become as much of a doctrine as a religion will be in a democracy. Second of all, the morality extension brought up by closing government. They say, so morality is really important to people and religion is really important to you in helping build that morality. We say, fine, have your private beliefs, but here's why they don't cross over into the public sphere. No, because it unfairly skews the democratic process when you are able to use the religious rhetoric as a rhetorical shortcut, which means that you don't have to justify any of your policies. More on that later. But second of all, you can't reconcile those positions, right? If you at least have a basis by which you need to justify your religious beliefs, then you at least are able to work from those first principles in order to try and work together with with other people. I don't think they managed to deal with that. Last of all, they say, so there's no objectively good policy. This is why you need religion. Precisely because you have no good, objectively good policy, that's why you need discourse. All right, what is the goal of democracy? The goal of democracy is quite straightforward, really. You want to represent interests, but more importantly, you want to give people a platform through which they can mediate those different kinds of interests. Political parties in power end up being representatives of a nation. They must take up and defend the interests of those, even those that detract from them when they eventually win an election. Why is it only possible to do this when you exist in a secular state? Because it is only possible to rationally understand the motives and thoughts behind philosophical viewpoints. Because you can accept on some level that your philosophical viewpoints were built wrongly, or that they should change in response to something else. But policies and stances of one religion can never represent other faiths in this way. This is why if you have a winning party, rationally accepting that your viewpoint might be wrong is impossible, because you would then have to deny that your religion was guiding you correctly all that time. What then are the characteristics of religion that are crucial to understanding this debate? Two things. First of all, that they are codified and communal, meaning that you cannot actually go against it without the rest of your community also agreeing. But second of all, that you have a belief in an ineffable and unaccountable entity. And that, I think, really gets to the heart of the debate. What then does this do for political discourse? First of all, on campaigning. No, thank you. The basis of discussion in a government relies on the government side on a priori assumption of religious doctrine. Why is this bad? First of all, because of mutual exclusivity. This means if I believe in a religion and you don't believe in the religion, you probably can't opt into the political party that's claiming to represent me and my religion. In this case, this means that religious political parties can always rely on what is essentially a captured constituency. Why is this bad? Because first of all, because religions are so communal, it is very difficult for you to vote against a political party that claims to represent not only you, but your community as a whole. This means that you as a religious person become more coerced into voting a certain way because you are a bad religious person if you don't, or because you will be viewed as immoral and sinful by the rest of your community. Note the language I'm couching this in, because that's also important. That's the kind of moral rhetoric that is painted onto those kinds of people, that they are sinful, that they will burn in hell. And precisely because you don't know whether that is true or not, you are more likely than not to vote a certain way because you are afraid of what happens to you religiously when you don't, than because you believe that those kinds of policy positions are the right policy positions for you. That's important because democracies try in as much as possible to guarantee you a choice of political positions and a choice of policy positions. In this case, you are pressured and coerced, therefore minimizing the amount of choice you are able to access. Secondly, it means that political parties then have no need to justify their policies, right? Like I say, you have a captured constituency going on there. But third of all, you can't really have criticism of them, of these kinds of policies, because any kind of criticism on a policy couched in religious grounds is taken as an attack on your religious principles and on your way of life, the very fundamental identity closing government wants to talk about. And on that note,
we allow people to vote regardless of religious beliefs.
Yes.
What is the distinction and why they can't speak in public?
yeah, so I think I just gave you the distinction because you, as an individual, you can vote however you want. Because quite frankly, you aren't speaking in public. Your voices aren't reaching maybe 1 million, 2 million people. Your beliefs, however you choose to exercise them, may impact the people directly around you, but do not skew the choices of other people in the same extent as a politician using that same kind of rhetoric will. And that's the distinction between state and church, private and public, that we're upholding closing opposition. All right, so then what happens in terms of policy outcomes? I think the fatalism inherent in religious determinism means that it allows governments to abdicate their responsibilities to people by referring them to a higher authority than the actual government. So religious fatalism is used to play down human free will by emphasizing divine predestination. So you discredit human reason, and God's will becomes an easy cover for a lack of planning or intellectual laziness. Since God is by definition ineffable, you can't properly represent people's interests or desires in the kinds of policies you want to have. What then does this mean in terms of policy? It means you get away as a government with shoddy work. It means you allow the poor to starve and tell them that it's okay because their suffering will bring them a better life in heaven. It means you see no need to provide hope to the people because the people can always turn to someone else. And you see no need in reaching out to anyone because after all, your religion comes first.
Ladies and gentlemen, the world of closing government in today's debate is very simple. We celebrate a world where Barack Obama could boldly come out and tell, like a populace, that he is a liberal or centrist or whatever, he's progressive, and is also religious. We think this is a true world that value individuals and like that helps shape like the morality of this individual, value these individuals in certain ways that does not infringe upon their right or capability to be able to discharge those duties based on mere perception that these individuals are religious, so therefore they are immoral, and then therefore their views are probably antithetical to the goal of what a true democracy should be. Two things in my speech. Firstly, I'll be addressing an issue on what a true democracy is and on what platform is this better accepted in all terms of outcomes and morality that we've given you from side closing government, right? But before then, 3 key responses, right? Firstly, on this like a premise to which probably OO started and CO hinted on a lot in their speech about how religious society works. I think a lot of their case was premised in a highly religious dominated society where individuals can quote probably biblical verses or Islamic verses and such, right? But we need to recognize that in this world, imposing secularism upon them itself is a fundamental infringement of rights of this individual, and given that they are majorities in these instances, we don't think then the goal of democracy is something they can achieve, because we think so democracy itself is one that honors self-determination of people within any stance that all are blind to probably any form of morality or what is objectively good or right in shutting people out of discourse, right? So I don't entirely see how any sort of discourse then could be achieved on their side of the house if your model is one that already shut majority of this community out of being able to have those discourse themselves, right? So I don't entirely see how you can take a preaching of accepting same-sex marriage or even things that contradict religious values in a way that you are telling them that you need to avoid all these things in the first place because you are wrong, you're not right, and you don't have any probably moral stand to say you don't have a God. I think a more reasonable one is one that probably recognizes the premise that these individuals probably owe some ideas behind like holding ideas behind all these like values, and is able to discuss or analyze this in the most form of possible. So we don't think that's the right context in today's debate. What we recognize, however, it's one in which probably society is already progressive in nature, right? One in which politicians cannot just come out and start quoting biblical or Islamic verses to you, right? Because we think in this world, right, this sort of politicians are already being laughed at in society. That is why a lot of society will recognize or at least respect individuals like Obama in terms of how he frames his policy or how he justifies his ideas versus someone like probably Ben Carson that just quotes Bible verses, right? So we think those are the society we need, this debate needed to educate on. But then on this idea of not being able to probably engage religion, I mean, like, because it's communal and those things, right? I don't think that's entirely possible, right? Because if you want to have this sort of discussions, right, then that's when you are able to use probably liberal or moderate aspects of those religions to engage this individual within those premises, right? So you just cannot come here and say, if you speak up against them, that's an entire community you're speaking up. Because we think morality itself is something society shapes in different manner. Things such as culture and things society is blind to. On their side of the house, we then deny people that are culturally inclined, stop them from running an office or stop them from having discourses regarding what they feel is a true reflection of themselves on the side of the house. I don't think that's something that's entirely valuable. But exactly what have we brought to you in today's debate, right? We tell you that more often than not, right? Like things that we decide based on morality are things that are more necessarily unconclusive in society, right? So we tell you more often than not, right? We need a model or a system that is able to accommodate different forms of views to which society is able to interpret all this ideology. So even if at the very worst case scenario, probably we could get a very highly religious society to embrace democracy, we think it's still the best or most true form of democracy on our side of the house. We think a wrong one is one that shut people, or even in most cases, exempt people from being able to reflect themselves in all those criteria, right? Because at best on their side of the house, all they achieve are these individuals probably at worst not being able to express themselves in public spaces, but go back underground to self-internalize those ideologies. We think that's why the chance we've given secularism itself is something that has failed community. Exactly how is this true, right? Firstly, right, we think like we've accommodated secularism method in terms of enforcing laws and things, right? We think more often than not, the usual form of outcome is one which society is usually apathetic to. An example of this is one you saw when probably the Supreme Court in the US legalized the same-sex marriage, right? Things such as people not being able to deal with those laws, or things such as individuals putting laws into their own hands in probably rejecting individuals from getting married in public churches are things that still go on in society. And exactly why is this so? Because of this individual feel threatened that their view are probably not listened to in the first place when those laws were passed. And these are the kind of likelihood of outcomes you get on their side of the house when laws are being passed and it's probably far from the reflection of those society. Yeah.
So you claim that states are very religious, but do you agree that when people organize around religious lines and deliberately arouse religious sentiment, that's when states become more fundamentalist and less yielding in their democracies?
So if that's what you want to talk about, like individual becoming more fundamentalist, right, within those circumstances, I think then the likelihood of scenarios on your side of the house is more and more people becoming fundamentalist because of the threat they perceive, right? But exactly other things that we talk to you about, what's the more important thing, right? In terms of how democracy is being accepted, probably in more developing or like conservative society, right? We've told you that these individuals are ones that probably accepted the probably evangelical versions of those religions and trying to adopt to those society. For vast majority of these individuals, they are probably okay with majorities of these minorities that they want to talk to on their side of the house, right? But the greater crime these minorities face on their model is one which is met with backlash, where those individuals or minorities are no longer recognized, like Eric gave you in the case of legalizing same-sex marriages in most of these developing nations, because they shaped their morality or values and have been able to self-determine within this circumstance, right? We tell you, right, their word is one that made the lives of minority far worse on their side of the house. And we think the true goal of democracy is one that allows individuals to self-determine themselves as society, or how they shape the true reflection of that society.
I'm going to look at three elements that are key for the existence of a democracy and analyze who best achieves that with or without secularism. So first, we're obviously going to talk about elections and the choosing of representatives, the idea that individuals should be as far as possible represented within their society, because the logic, of course, then is if you choose people who best represent you, that allows you choice, freedom, the ability also then for them to make decisions on your behalf. Secondly, this idea that when people are elected, there ought to be debate in society, and that should then lead to policies that best help society as a whole, rather than just a majority or even just a minority. So let's firstly discuss this idea of choosing representatives, because something that exclusively comes up in closing up that is not dealt with at all by closing government is the role of how this is really going to function in terms of elections and political party systems, right? So let's understand why this is particularly problematic, right? Since a key part or key cornerstone of democracy has to be elections and representation, we talk about how most likely you're going to see the rise of religious parties, right? Parties that are supposed to cater specifically to Islam, to people from the Islamic faith, or Christian parties, or Hindu parties, as we see in India, and why that's problematic, right? We think firstly, this hurts two groups of people. Firstly, it obviously hurts religious individuals, right? Because they are now coerced into a choice, because in order to be a good Muslim, you must, for instance, vote for your Muslim brother. Because of the communal nature of most religions, the fact that they are often seen as individuals that you must share an affinity for, and you should not vote, for instance, for a heathen or pagan or somebody who's non-godlike, right? So, for instance, a non-Christian, you are less likely to be able to vote for them, and the pressure is going to be much greater. This argument, this logic that comes out exclusively from talking about the communalism or the communal nature of religion and the pressures it creates upon individuals. But I think more importantly, there is also a debate about the question about non-religious, increasing numbers of, firstly, non-religious people, but also people who aren't necessarily represented by the religious party that's likely to get into power. If you don't identify from, for instance, a Muslim party in Malaysia, what is likely to happen to you as a non-Muslim? It means that firstly, that choice is simply removed from you, because the only reason why you should vote for that Muslim party is simply because they come or they're calling upon God. And because they haven't necessarily given any other justification for their policy positions, you automatically have no way in which you can you can judge their policy positions and whether they're likely to be able to do it well or do it badly. And so since then, you can't access their thought process, and you can't buy into the very premises of their policies in the first place. That choice is automatically removed for you. We think that is bad. They come up and they say, but it's important, for instance, that Obama, and we think it's important that Obama comes out and says that he's Christian. That's precisely the issue in the United States. The fact that American presidents, for instance, we cannot conceive of a non-Christian American president. Even the idea of a Mormon was particularly problematic. Even the idea of having a Catholic was particularly difficult. We think that's particularly problematic when individuals can't even run for office because they can't say, oh, I am a Muslim, for instance, or I just am an atheist, because of the fact that religion is permeated. That's an argument for more secularism and not for less. Let's go to the second argument, because let's understand that in this case, we want to talk not merely about debate when it comes to campaigning, but we also talk about the debate in Parliament itself and how that's important in terms of creating. Obviously, there are a few issues in this particular case, right? Firstly, there are different starting positions. Let's understand the role of religion in terms of the metrics by which we are able to judge how we make decisions when it comes to an issue. Think about it the easiest way I can provide for you, right? We all start with premises about, for instance, the rules of debate, what is valuable and what is not, for instance, right? Engagement, doing your technical role of fulfilling an extension. Therefore, I can decide that you are worthy of my vote in such, or you rather, you think that you are whatever. Anyway, the point here is that having a common metric allows us to make decisions, especially in a heterogeneous society where there are multiple religions. They haven't engaged with the idea that what happens when you have different religious parties engaging in a discussion. Can they have a proper discussion if all of them, because they are voted in by constituents who expect them to quote the Quran or the Bible? These are mutually exclusive positions. First, and furthermore, you cannot contest those bases because those bases are supposedly uncontestable and literally often, in some cases, sacred cows. So we think in that particular case, you can't have just simply a meaningful discussion because it would just simply be a matter of name calling. Even if you wanted to have that discussion, because religion is so personal as closing gov wants to say, most likely that people will take it as personal slights. You know, there's going to be huge amounts of mudslinging, not any meaningful discussion within it, simply inflaming people's religious sensitivities. Sit down. Well, so we don't think that you necessarily then create a useful discussion within Parliament itself, apart from hurting representation. Their simple argument is, but we need to recognize that religion adds morality or influences morality, influences laws all the time. This is basically what closing government wants to say. Look, we can recognize that religion does play a role. We can recognize, for instance, that in many societies, in Anglo-Saxon societies, Christianity's played a role. The difference is, today, should it continue to play a role in a society where most people are not Christian, where increasingly people are choosing to adhere to alternative faiths or non-faiths at all. How do we create a more inclusive democracy, especially when democracy cares about the increasing heterogeneity, cares about increasing diversity of thought, so you increase choice as well as to engage that diversity. But the third question we want to ask is, the logic of debate is not merely for debate alone, and that's the shortcoming of closing government. All they want to talk about is discourse and not talk about the impacts of that discourse. The reason why we want to have a discourse as inclusive as possible is because the policies that we then create are as inclusive as possible, right? If I then, for instance, have a large debate about the utility of ensuring that everybody, for instance, has basic things like it's important, for instance, that we ensure social equality, for instance, because social inequality creates political instability or whatever. We think that in that case, you're more likely to be able to engage with it. We're able to have a proper discussion that allows, for instance, catering to the lowest common denominator. Let's then understand the policies then, because what we've only heard, basically, finally dealing with OG, is this idea that the lack of value when it comes to policies is that we can't deal with disadvantaged religious minorities because we don't recognize religion, their main contribution to this debate. Firstly, it's not clear that this is true. I think opening dealt with this enough. But more important in this particular case is what's problematic, and this is something they also did not deal with, is Ernting's key analysis about fatalism. The problem when religion comes in, and you use it as justification, firstly, in accountability for how you get elected in the very first place, right? So you're like, oh, I am religious and I want to, for instance, place in Sharia law, for instance. But the moment, or some sort of system in place, the moment when, because I'm brought in by God's will or whatever justification, right? Now then, if anything fails, I can go, well, it's God's will for you. There's not much we can do for it. We saw this, for instance, in the Protestant ethic. People were poor because that's what God's will desired for them. If that's God's will, then who was man to change God's will? If man is supposed to be subordinate to God, you cannot decide on behalf of God who it is and think that's problematic.
Are you fucking debate?